So the topic of exceptions, it's not too bad actually. So far, when you've been writing your code, you know, when Python detects an error, it's crashed, your code has crashed basically. You get some kind of error message and you go, oh, I have to fix my bug. Now, exceptions will allow you to handle those errors more gracefully. So if there is an error, you can plan for how you would like that to be handled. So with exceptions, when Python detects an error, it can raise, or also called throw, an exception. If the exception is not handled in the program crashes like it did before, and the error is displayed in the traceback message. So we want to prevent this from happening and crashing, so we're going to include a handler. So we'll have a look at that in just a moment. Now, there are different types of error exceptions. Value error is an invalid value for a function. An input-output error, we're not going to actually cover that. That's when you fail to open, read, or write a file. Type error is an invalid operation for a variable. Don't worry about index error or key errors. We haven't yet covered lists, coming next lesson, or dictionaries. Zero division error we will cover when you attempt to divide by zero. So in order to catch and handle an exception, you are going to need a try and except statements that go together. Now, I'll point with my mouse. You can see that the try and the except are aligned along the same line, and then the code inside the try will be indented, and the code inside the except will be indented. So let's dive in and have a look. Let's have a look at the example of a zero division error. Now, here is a piece of code. Let's pull it up in Sublime. So let's do this. Make it nice and big so you can see that quickly. So we have two inputs that we're requiring, number 1 and number 2. And then we're going to divide those two numbers, and then we're going to print number 1 divided by number 2 is, and the result. Now, let's go ahead and run this. So let me pull up my terminal, make it a bit bigger. And so you can write out the code in your Sublime. My file is called 0.py, and you can save it in class week 8, because we are actually in week 8 now. So I'm going to cd over to that. Let's see. You can find it. Okay. So if you need some time to type it up, just pause your video here, and I'm going to run my code. So Python 3. So I'm going to enter a number. So say I'm going to enter 2, and then I'm going to try and divide that by 0. So my second number is going to be 0. And you will see here that we get an error. So it says 0 division error, division by 0. Right. So we're getting an error there. And if you need to catch up, just pause the video, and then you can come back and play it. So yeah, try dividing by 0, pause video here, and I put a screenshot of that here. So we want to be able to handle this exception gracefully. So we can put a try, and inside of the try, we are going to put, in fact, let me show you in Sublime. So I am going to comment out these 2 lines, and I'm going to bring in these lines. So what's happening here is that I'm still asking for input. That is outside of the try except, because the error that I'm trying to test for is this zero division error. Now, if you have a look in your terminal, when you got this error, you see here it said zero division error. Well, this line here is referring exactly to that. So what this piece of code is saying, it's saying try to run this piece of code. If you get this kind of error, the zero division error, then please print you cannot divide by zero. If no zero division error occurs, then this line will never happen. So I'll just say that again. So inside of your try, you're saying, please try this piece of code. And if there is this particular error, in this case, the zero division error, then print you cannot divide by zero. If there is no zero division error, it will never print that line. It will just run these lines inside the try. So let's have a go and see what that looks like. So let me bring this here. We need to Python 3 0.py. So I'm going to enter 2 and 0. And now we get this graceful handling of this error. It just says you cannot divide by 0. I don't get this program crashing, trying to figure out what's going on. And then if I run this code again and I just, say 2 divided by 2, let me pull this up. You just get a nice printout that we have here in this line, 2 divided by 2 is 1.0. And this line inside of the except, the handling, the exception, never gets called. Okay? And feel free to rewatch this because it's recorded. And here is a screenshot. Okay. So now we're going to talk about value errors. That was a zero division error. So let's go back and have a look. Value errors is some kind of invalid value for a function. For example, here, let me pull this up in my, let me pull this up in my code. So for example, hours worked, we're asking for input and we're asking for it to be an integer, right? Remember, input is a built-in Python function. Now, if we don't enter an integer, that's not going to work. That's going to be an incorrect value that we're entering into a function. So let's actually try this first. So create a new Sublime file. Mine is called value_error.py. And you can pause the video while you do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and run my code. So I'm going to say Python 3. So I'm not waiting because, you can pause the video. So enter the number of hours worked. So if I entered something that was not an integer, like A, the program would crash. And you would see here that it actually says that we have a value error, right? It says invalid little for int. So it's expecting an int and it's not getting an int. So that's our value error. So what we need to do to fix it is we can do a try except, and this time, instead of doing a zero division error, we're going to do a value error. So let's pull up Sublime and take a look so we can do that. So I'm going to comment all of this out and comment this back in. You can pause the video to do this one. So you see here that now I'm trying to get the input and print the input inside of the try block. And then I'm saying, if there is an exception of a value error, then print. And I chose input must be an integer. Okay? So if it is an integer, this line will never get called. But if we enter something that's not an integer, then we will get this line instead. So let's have a look and see what happens. So now, let me just save this first. Let's run this. So enter number of hours worked, let's say B, not an integer, and we get input must be an integer. And you notice here that this line, the print hours worked, doesn't get called. Instead, it prints this. Okay. If I do enter an integer 2, then the integer gets printed and this never gets called. Okay? So just as like before. And feel free to rewatch this again. Okay. All right. So we can actually do this with multiple except statements. So we can say try, colon, enter some code, and then we can enter, a zero division error, a value error, we can enter all sorts of errors that we want to try and handle different errors. And we can handle those errors however we want with specific messages inside each block. Now, if we're feeling particularly lazy, we could write one generic except statement, and we could say try, some piece of code, and then any error that occurs, we could say, oh, an error occurred. And, this does handle everything, but then you don't have a specific message. So you're just saying, oh, something went wrong, which isn't super helpful. Okay. So now that we've looked a little bit at exceptions, when exactly is a program going to crash? So when an error exception occurs in the code that isn't in a try block, or when an error exception occurs in a try block but no exception handler is provided for it. So what does this mean? So for example, the first case, when an error exception occurs in code that isn't in a try block, for example, when we just did the example we did, the code that's commented out, I'll put it back in. If we just had this code, we'd still get our error exception because it's not in a try block. And when it occurs in a try block, but no exception handler is provided for it. So for example, in this example, if I was trying to do some kind of division inside of my try block, but I wasn't checking for the except division error, then I could still get something crashing because I didn't check for dividing by 0. So I hope that makes sense. So I'll repeat that again. So if here I was trying to do something like, hours worked, let's see, I'm going to print this. Print hours worked divided by, I don't know, 0, right? Then I haven't gotten, 0 division error handling here. So I would still get my error. So I would have to do another except and do 0 division error. Okay. So when you're trying not to get your code to crash, just be sure that A, your code is in a try block, and B, you are handling the exception that you are wanting to provide. Okay. Now, to add a new clause into the mix, we also have an else clause. So you can place an else clause after all of the except blocks. It's run after the try block if there are no exceptions. So we'll have a look in just an example. We'll have a look at an example in just a moment. But the idea is you have your try, you have your except, and then you have your else. So if your except is never, if there's no errors, if nothing is called in any of your except, then it will run your code in your try, and then it will go to your else and run the code in your else. And just before we look at an example of that, let's also just look at the finally clause. So the finally clause is placed after all the except blocks, and it's run whether the except blocks are triggered or not. So it's after everything. So it will run all the time, no matter what is happening with your exceptions. And the reason why we have a finally is that it's useful for cleanup things such as closing files. So if you're trying to write to a file, you want to make sure that your file is closed whether you have an exception thrown or not. So let's have a look at an example that has both of these. So I'm going to pull this up in Sublime. Take this out. Okay. So nope, this one. Okay. So here we have a try statement, and we're just asking for an integer input. So please enter the starting bank. Then we're going to have a value error. So remember, that's when we enter something that is not an integer. So remember, that's an invalid value going into a function. So if we entered something that wasn't an integer, like a or hello or something else, exclamation mark, then it will print bank balance must be a numerical value. And then we have this else clause that prints this is the else block, and then we have this finally clause that prints this is the finally block. So in the slide here, I asked what gets printed if the user enters 20, what gets printed if the user enters hello. So if you want, you can take a moment, you can pause the video and just take a moment to think about it and try to predict what's going to happen. Okay, so now, and also pause the video if you wish to write out the code, because now we're going to run it. So let's do Python 3 try, oh, and I call this one try.py, just so you know. So we're going to enter the starting bank balance. So let's start off with a regular integer, let's say 20. And this is what happens. So because we entered 20, which is an integer, this value error will never be triggered. So this is okay. This line is not going to be called. You can see that line is not printed. So because this was okay, the else clause can run. So remember, the else clause runs only if there were no exceptions triggered or thrown, I should say. So that's why we're getting the line, this is the else block, because we don't have any exceptions that are thrown. Then with the finally block, remember, finally gets printed no matter what. So it will get printed whether this is an integer or not. So in this case, you know, it's an integer, it doesn't matter, it's going to print. This is the finally block. Okay. So let's do this again, and this time let's enter, you know, hello. So now you see that this exception is thrown. So it says bank balance must be a numerical value. Right here. So that's our value error. But remember, the really nice thing about exceptions is that the programs don't crash, which means that we can keep running. So we've handled our exception gracefully. Our program hasn't crashed. We're not going to print our else because the else only gets printed if no exceptions are thrown. But our finally clause is going to get printed because it's going to get printed regardless, and it says this is the final result. So just make sure that you understand that one, and then I think you will start to get a more solid understanding of exceptions and why they're so great to use. Okay. Now, because we have this ability to keep the program running, technically we could use them when we're trying to validate user inputs. So we're having, someone ask for user input, and they enter something wrong, and we want to handle that gracefully, and then we want to give them a chance to enter the correct answer, or the correct value. So we can use our validating user input knowledge to do this, that we've learned before. So let's go first of all and review how we can validate user inputs in general. So this is nothing new. This is without exceptions. So for example, here we have our Boolean flag. So our Boolean variable, again, we set to true. And we say while again, so while this is true, we're going to ask for input, some integer. And then we're going to say if, actually, let me do this in Sublime, it's better. Oh no, I don't have it in Sublime, never mind. If n is greater than 0 and n is less than 6, then we can say again is false, because we just asked for an integer between 1 and 5. So if they did enter something between 1 and 5, we don't want to loop again, right? So we can just say again is false. We set our Boolean flag to false, so we're not going to loop again. And then we stop, right? And that's fine. We're not going to loop again because now again is false. Now, if we went in and they entered, say, 6, so n is not less than 6, then we're going to go to else and we say print, oops, this isn't between 1 and 5. And then we're going to go around again, because again, still true. So just take a moment to let that sink in. It's great that this is being recorded. You can just play it again. And then you can come to class on Thursday or Tuesday next week and ask questions about that. Because that's important for in-class 10. Now, we want to add an exception into input validation, and we're going to add them into our while loop. And we're going to keep looping until the user enters a valid value. So first of all, let's have a look at it without a while loop. So here we're saying try, and inside of the try block we have them, entering an integer. And if they don't enter an integer, i.e. if it's a value error, then we're going to print, oops, this isn't an integer. So let me comment this, and you can create a new file. Mine is called valid.py. You can pause the video, and then you can run your code with you. Python 3 valid.py. So first of all, let me enter an integer. So like if I enter 2, that's fine. I don't get any of this exception thrown, so I don't get this line. If I run it again and I enter A, then I don't get the printout. Instead, well, actually, I wasn't getting the printout anyway in this code, but if I was printing out, I wouldn't have got it. And then I get print, oops, that isn't an integer. So that's without any exception. So sorry, that's without any while loop. So hopefully that's straightforward. Now let's go and add the while loop into that. So this is very important slide. So let's go and have a look at this in Sublime. Okay, so let's go through this carefully. So again, we have our Boolean flag, again equals true. And this time we're moving the try except inside of the while loop. So we're saying while true, or while again, so right now it's true, We're going to try, we're going to say, ask for this input, please enter an integer. And if it is an integer, we will be able to carry on and set again to false. So I put here in the comments, if we get here to this line, the input is valid. So if we set again to false, we're not going to loop again. We know we've got an integer and we can just exit the while loop and continue. And you know that we're not going to hit the except if it's an integer. Now, if they don't enter an integer, right, this is going to get triggered, the value error exception, and this line is going to be printed, which means that this line is never going to happen. So if this is not an integer, we are never going to be able to set again to false. We're just going to go straight here. So we're going to go from here to this line. And then again, it's still going to be true. So we're going to print, oops, that is an integer. And then we're going to loop again, because again, it's still true. And we're going to loop in the while loop, one more iteration. We're going to go into the try block and we're going to ask for input again. So let's actually see this in action. So maybe this will help us better understand. Okay. So I'm going to enter in, first of all, enter an integer. So I'm going to enter 2, and that's fine. This was an integer. Again, gets set to false, so I don't loop through again, and I just exit out of the while loop. And now I'm going to run it again, and I'm going to say A. And see, this is different now. So it says, oops, that is an integer like before, but now it's asking me to enter another integer again. It's prompting me again, because again is still equal to true, because I never got to this line. So I iterate again in the while loop, and then I ask for input again. So if I now say B, it's gonna iterate, it's gonna loop again in the while loop. If I say, you know, hello, it's gonna keep doing it. It's never gonna set again to false until I enter an integer. And then I'm gonna enter an integer, I don't know, like let's do a different one, 7. And now I can exit the while loop. So I really recommend that you take some time to understand this, because you're going to need to do this for your in-class exercise 10. And this is the sort of thing you want to understand for your quiz.